So the fundamental question really is what causes climate to change? Is it human causes that cause climate to change, like greenhouse gases and land use change and smoke and dust and aerosols and stuff? Or is it natural causes like changes in sunlight, ocean conditions, volcanoes and stuff? And it's a global thermohaline circulation, which according to Broker operates kind of like a conveyor belt. And the idea here is that there's a net movement of warm water from the Pacific to the Atlantic and cold water back in the other direction some of the time. And in other cases, it either reverses itself or slows down. The point is that the Atlantic and the Pacific are out of phase with each other in terms of their temperatures. In fact, this is what I was looking at in 1994. This is 100 years of precipitation from the Oregon coast, and there aren't very many average years. Mostly we get wetter years, positive anomalies, wet years, or dry years, or the reds. Now, over 100 years or so, there's about an equal number of reds and blues, but there are also periods of about 25 years or so where there is a predominance of one color or another. Roughly a 50-year cycle in weather climate in the Northwest. Let's talk about the ENSO connection, the El Nino Southern Oscillation. And there are the three phases. The cool tongue here during the average year, a much bigger cool tongue in the La Nina. And with an El Nino, the cool tongue more or less disappears. Ocean temperatures are more or less uniform. There is more heat that comes out of that window than any place else. And therefore, major changes or disruptions or redistributions of the sea surface temperature in the zone affect not only the Pacific Basin, not only the Northern Hemisphere, they literally affect the entire world. This shows at least some of the teleconnections. Teleconnections are the effects of changes in the El Nino Southern Oscillation and how they're manifest in different parts of the world. Now, salmon is considered one of the bellwether species in the Pacific Northwest, an indicator. Some people call it one of the canaries in the coal mine, and there's been some concern about dwindling numbers of salmon, and along with it, the suspicion that it's people that are really influencing salmon populations. This shows the 5-year running average spring Chinook salmon in the Columbia River. And the fish counts began in 1938, and this is through about 1990 or 91. Big numbers mean more fish, and this means less fish. So from the 50s, 60s, early 70s, there were large numbers of salmon that returned, and then it just kind of fell through the roof in the mid-70s and stayed low. Anecdotal information from this period suggested that the 20s, 30s, and early 40s were rather poor from the standpoint of fish returns, but the early part of the century was actually pretty good. So it does certainly suggest that there was something cyclical that was going on. But the big concern was this one, that something caused the fish to basically be gone. There were many, many fewer fish, averaging here about 180,000 a year, down here to maybe 60 or 70,000. Now this was a chart that Jim Anderson prepared, and he and a fellow named Kurt Evismeyer came up with an index. They call it the Pacific Northwest Index. And you notice the blue here matches the blue, and the blue is relatively cool and wet periods. The red is warm and dry, and the red periods pretty much coincided with the periods that we either measured fewer fish returns or at least anecdotally assumed that. This is my chart of 5-year average. That's what we're looking at. And the talk around the Northwest was the fish are going away, and it's because of either overfishing or habitat or dams, or those darn foresters cutting down all the trees. I mean, it had to be one of those four. In 1995, I stuck my neck out and said, in the Northwest, we are going to go from a mostly dry period that we've had 10 dry years in a row, to a mostly wet period. In 1996, this cycle that first named by the University of Washington, they were looking at this simultaneous with me, and I should have named it. I could have called it whatever I wanted, I guess, but they named it the PDO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And then in 96, I predicted that the salmon returns were going to increase as well, because I felt that the most significant influence on salmon was the combination of climate and ocean conditions. Here are some of the characteristics of the PDO as it shifts back and forth from one mode to another. The Aleutian low pressure center shifts westward or eastward depending on which phase. By the way, the positive phase is the mostly El Nino phase, and the negative phase is mostly La Nina. We see these flip-flops in a lot of different physical parameters. In addition, some of the natural resource parameters like fish and birds and so on. At the top is a time series of the strength of the Aleutian low. When we have an El Nino event, you tend to get a deeper Aleutian low which forms a ridge over the west coast. The La Ninas tend to have less tendency towards an Aleutian low and a stronger mid-latitude jet, and the jet stream tends to be over the northwest. Now sometimes this PDO changes really quickly, and the most dramatic one is one that was mentioned by Pat Michaels last night, is the one in 1976. And one of the ways it was manifest was this step change in temperatures in Alaska. And this is an average of temperature of 4 cities in Alaska: Nome, Barrow, Fairbanks, and Anchorage. And basically you have very little change prior to 1975, and very little change after, and about a 2.5 degree Fahrenheit step change between 1976 and 1977. Here's another parameter that we really pay attention to in the Northwest. It's an upwelling index. It's developed by a fellow named Andrew Bakken, and it's based primarily on the surface Ekman transport caused by winds. When winds are strong and blow from north to south, you tend to get Coriolis, essentially pushing or diverting the surface water offshore, allowing upwelling to occur. And upwelling is really essential for productivity of the ocean. The more the upwelling, the more the small creatures can feed and multiply, and the more food there is for the bigger fish. So the periods with higher upwelling tend to be more productive. And what you can see from this is something, again, looks rather cyclical, with a peak in the 60s and early 70s, a trough in the 80s, and then rising again in the late 90s to about this time. I plotted the PDO, the annual PDO, with the Bakken index, and it generally matches up pretty well. And especially in the last 35 years or so, the PDO tends to lead the upwelling index. So that's a pretty good indication that we do have a cause and effect. Obviously, the Bakken index isn't going to affect the PDO, but it makes sense that the PDO would affect that because of the big change in weather patterns. So as we go back and we look at that 5-year average in salmon, summer Chinook returns, and now bring it up to date, this is what we see. As we apparently have had a PDO shift in the mid-90s, we've seen a tremendous turn back upwards in summer Chinook, and matching really quite well what we see from the PDO. Other researchers, and they've compared it with a bunch of other parameters: an atmospheric circulation index, Mauna Loa CO2 changes, a regime indicator series for anchovies and sardines, and an ecosystem index. Here's another paper with the PDO at the top, the zooplankton numbers in the second number, the coho survival, and northern copepods at the bottom. Again, a lot of evidence is piling up that these multi-decadal cycles are affecting a variety of climate and natural resource parameters.